Hey there. Tonight we're heading back to the dying days of the Old West to uncover the story of a man caught between two worlds, two loyalties, two versions of himself. This is the story of Javier Escuella, a revolutionary who became an outlaw, a loyal friend who became a betrayer, and a man whose choices in moments of crisis revealed who he truly was beneath the charm and the guitar songs. If this story helps you rest easy, feel free to like the video because I found that 90% of you haven't subscribed to the channel. Please do. It really helps out and takes a lot of time to make these videos, and I'd love to know in the comments where you're listening from. It's always good to know who else is out there settling in for the night. Javier Escuella's story is one of loyalty tested and broken, of idealism corrupted by pragmatism, of a man who fled one failed revolution only to find himself in the middle of another. His journey through the Red Dead Redemption series is both tragic and revealing, showing how good intentions and genuine bonds can be twisted by fear, manipulation, and the desperate need to belong. Understanding Javier means understanding the Mexico he fled, the gang he joined, the choices he made when everything fell apart, and the man he became when loyalty to Dutch van der Linde overrode everything else he once believed. This is the complete story of Javier Escuella, revolutionary, outlaw, musician, friend, and ultimately survivor at any cost. Javier Escuella was born in Nuevo Paraíso, Mexico, probably in the late 1860s or early 1870s, making him in his late 20s or early 30s during the events of Red Dead Redemption 2 in 1899. His early life in Mexico was shaped by poverty, oppression, and the brutal dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, who ruled Mexico with an iron fist for over 3 decades. Diaz's regime was characterized by extreme inequality, with a small elite controlling most of the country's wealth, while the vast majority of Mexicans lived in desperate poverty. Land was concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy families, workers had no rights or protections, and political dissent was crushed with violence and imprisonment. Javier grew up in this environment of injustice and oppression, watching his people suffer under a government that served the wealthy and foreign interests while ignoring the needs of ordinary Mexicans. This experience shaped Javier's political consciousness and his sense of justice. He wasn't content to accept the status quo, to live his life in poverty and submission, while others prospered from his people's labour. Javier became involved in revolutionary activities, joining groups that opposed Diaz's dictatorship and fought for land reform, workers' rights, and political freedom. These weren't just abstract political positions for Javier, they were personal, rooted in his own experiences and his genuine desire to make life better for his people. The exact nature of Javier's revolutionary activities is never fully detailed in the games, but we know he was involved in violent resistance against the Diaz regime. Javier killed a powerful man in Mexico, someone connected to the government or the wealthy elite, someone whose death made Javier a wanted man. This wasn't a random act of violence or a crime of passion. It was a political act, an assassination, or an act of revolutionary justice. But regardless of Javier's motivations or the justice of his cause, the result was that he had to flee Mexico or face execution. The Diaz regime didn't tolerate dissent, and revolutionaries who killed government officials or wealthy landowners were hunted down and killed without trial. Javier fled north across the border into the United States, probably in the early to mid-1890s. He arrived in America as a refugee and a fugitive, alone in a foreign country where he didn't speak the language well, where Mexicans faced discrimination and suspicion, where he had no money no connections, and no prospects. Javier survived through whatever means he could, probably doing manual labour, possibly engaging in petty crime, living on the margins of American society. This period of Javier's life was difficult and lonely, a time when he was cut off from his home and his cause, surviving day to day without purpose or community. Then Javier met Dutch van der Linde, and everything changed. The exact circumstances of their meeting aren't detailed in the games, but it happened sometime in the mid-1890s, probably around 1895 or 1896. Dutch found Javier in a bad situation, possibly starving or in danger, and helped him. Dutch didn't just give Javier food or money, he offered Javier something more valuable: belonging, purpose, and a new cause to believe in. Dutch's philosophy about living free from civilization's rules, about taking from the rich and helping the poor, about creating a community of outcasts who looked after each other, resonated deeply with Javier's revolutionary ideals. Dutch seemed to offer what Javier had been fighting for in Mexico, a way of life based on justice and mutual support rather than exploitation and oppression. Javier joined the van der Linde gang and quickly became one of its most loyal and valued members. He brought skills that the gang needed. He was an excellent gunfighter, skilled with both revolvers and rifles, capable in combat and reliable under pressure. He was also charming and personable, able to talk to people and gather information, useful for scouting and for maintaining relationships with contacts and allies. Javier spoke Spanish fluently and English well enough to function, making him valuable for operations in areas with large Mexican populations or for dealing with Spanish-speaking contacts. And Javier was a talented musician, playing guitar and singing songs that brought joy and culture to the gang's camps, creating moments of beauty and connection in the midst of their violent, chaotic lives. But more than his skills, Javier brought loyalty and genuine belief in Dutch's vision. Javier wasn't just following Dutch for profit or protection. He genuinely believed in what Dutch claimed the gang stood for. Dutch had saved Javier when he was alone and desperate, had given him a new family and a new purpose. Javier's loyalty to Dutch was personal and deep, rooted in gratitude and genuine affection. Dutch became a father figure to Javier, much as he was to Arthur and John, and Javier would do anything for Dutch, would follow him anywhere, would believe anything Dutch told him. By 1899, Javier had been with the gang for several years and had become one of its core members. He was close friends with Arthur Morgan, John Marston, Bill Williamson, and the other long-time gang members. He participated in the gang's major operations, fought in their battles, and contributed to their survival and success. Javier was known for his loyalty, his skill, his charm, and his music. He seemed content with his life in the gang, having found the belonging and purpose he'd lost when he fled Mexico. The gang was his family, Dutch was his leader and saviour, and the outlaw life, for all its dangers and hardships, gave Javier something to believe in and fight for. Javier's relationships within the gang were generally positive and warm. He was friendly with most gang members, got along well with the women in camp, and was particularly close to Arthur, John, and Bill. These men were his brothers, people he'd fought alongside, people he trusted with his life. Javier's friendship with Arthur was especially significant, as Arthur was Dutch's right hand and the gang's most respected member. Arthur and Javier worked together on numerous jobs, watched each other's backs in fights, and shared the bond that comes from surviving danger together. There was genuine affection and respect between them. a friendship that seemed unbreakable. Javier's relationship with John Marston was also close, though perhaps less deep than his friendship with Arthur. John was younger and less mature than Arthur, more prone to mistakes and poor decisions, but Javier seemed to like John and enjoy his company. They worked together, drank together, and shared the camaraderie of the gang. Javier's relationship with Bill Williamson was more complicated, as Bill was less intelligent and more volatile than Arthur or John, but they were still friends and allies, united by their loyalty to Dutch and their shared experiences in the gang. The events of Red Dead Redemption 2 begin with the gang in crisis, fleeing into the mountains after the disastrous Blackwater ferry robbery. Javier is there with the gang, helping them survive the harsh winter conditions, participating in the search for supplies and the rescue of John from wolves. During this early part of the game, Javier is still the loyal, capable gang member he's always been, doing his part to help the gang survive and recover from the Blackwater disaster. There's no indication yet of the choices Javier will make later, no sign of the betrayal that's coming. As the gang descends from the mountains and establishes camp at Horseshoe Overlook, Javier continues to be a reliable and active member. He goes on jobs with Arthur and other gang members, helps gather supplies and money, participates in the gang's operations. Javier is particularly useful in situations that require charm or Spanish language skills, able to talk to people and gather information in ways that some of the other gang members can't. He's also valuable in combat, skilled and brave, someone who can be counted on in a fight. Throughout the early and middle parts of Red Dead Redemption 2, Javier remains loyal and supportive of Dutch, even as Dutch's judgment begins to deteriorate and his decisions become increasingly questionable. When Dutch starts listening more to Micah Bell and less to Hosea Matthews and Arthur, Javier doesn't question it. When Dutch makes reckless decisions that endanger the gang, Javier supports him. When tensions rise between Arthur and Dutch, Javier sides with Dutch without hesitation. This loyalty isn't blind or stupid. Javier can see that things are going wrong, that Dutch is changing, that the gang is falling apart. But Javier's loyalty to Dutch is so deep, so fundamental to his identity and his sense of belonging, that he can't bring himself to question or oppose Dutch, even when Dutch is clearly wrong. This unwavering loyalty is both Javier's greatest virtue and his fatal flaw. Loyalty is admirable, especially in the context of the gang where loyalty to each other is supposed to be paramount. Javier's loyalty to Dutch is genuine and rooted in real gratitude and affection. Dutch saved Javier's life, gave him a new family and purpose, and Javier genuinely believes Dutch is a good man trying to do right by his people. But loyalty becomes a flaw when it's given to someone who doesn't deserve it, when it prevents you from seeing truth or doing what's right, when it makes you complicit in harm and betrayal. As the gang situation deteriorates throughout Red Dead Redemption 2, Javier's loyalty to Dutch is tested in increasingly difficult ways. The gang loses members to death and capture. They're constantly on the run from law enforcement. Dutch's plans consistently fail or make things worse, and tensions within the gang grow as members start questioning Dutch's leadership. Through all of this, Javier remains loyal to Dutch, defending him in arguments, supporting his decisions, refusing to acknowledge that Dutch might be the problem rather than the solution. The turning point comes after the gang returns from Guarma, the Caribbean island where they were stranded after the failed St. Denis bank robbery. The gang that returns to America is smaller, more fractured, and more desperate than the one that left. Hosea Matthews is dead, executed by the Pinkertons during the bank robbery. Lenny Summers is dead, killed during the escape. The gang's money's gone, their camps have been destroyed, and they're more wanted than ever. Dutch is increasingly paranoid and erratic, believing there's a traitor in the gang, listening almost exclusively to Micah Bell while dismissing or ignoring the counsel of Arthur and others. Arthur, who's been diagnosed with tuberculosis and is dying, starts actively working against Dutch's plans, trying to ensure that John Marston and his family escape and have a chance at a better life. Arthur can see that Dutch is leading the gang toward destruction, that Dutch's ego and paranoia are making him dangerous to the people who followed him for years. Arthur tries to get other gang members to see this, to recognize that Dutch has changed, and that following him will only lead to death or capture. But most gang members, including Javier, refuse to see it, or refuse to act on it. The final confrontation comes after the gang's last train robbery, which turns out to be an army ambush that nearly kills them all. John is captured during the chaos, and Dutch, instead of immediately planning a rescue like he would have in the past, hesitates and makes excuses. Arthur, knowing he's dying and determined to save John, decides to rescue John with or without Dutch's blessing. This is the moment when the gang splits completely, when members have to choose between Dutch and Arthur, between blind loyalty and doing what's right. Javier's choice in this moment is revealing and tragic. When Arthur confronts Dutch about abandoning John, when the gang divides into those supporting Arthur and those supporting Dutch, Javier sides with Dutch. But notably, Javier doesn't draw his gun on Arthur. He points his gun up in the air, unable or unwilling to actually aim at his friend, but also unable or unwilling to support Arthur against Dutch. This moment shows Javier's internal conflict, his loyalty to Dutch warring with his friendship with Arthur, his inability to choose between them, leading him to a compromise that satisfies neither loyalty nor friendship. This choice, this moment of pointing his gun in the air rather than at Arthur or at Dutch, is the defining moment of Javier's character. It shows that Javier isn't evil or cruel, that he still cares about Arthur and doesn't want to hurt him. But it also shows that Javier's loyalty to Dutch is stronger than his friendship with Arthur, that when forced to choose, Javier chooses Dutch, even though Dutch is clearly wrong. Javier's compromise, pointing his gun in the air, is an attempt to avoid making a real choice, to maintain both loyalties without committing to either. But in a moment of crisis, neutrality is itself a choice, and Javier's refusal to support Arthur is effectively support for Dutch. After this confrontation, Javier flees with Dutch, Micah, Bill and a few other gang members, abandoning Arthur and John and the others who oppose Dutch. Javier's fate after this point isn't shown in Red Dead Redemption 2, but we know from the first Red Dead Redemption game what happens to him. Javier continues to follow Dutch for a while, but eventually the group fragments. Dutch disappears into the wilderness, becoming increasingly isolated and paranoid. Micah forms his own gang and continues his criminal activities. Bill forms his own gang in New Mexico, and Javier returns to Mexico, going back to the country he fled years earlier. The Javier we meet in Red Dead Redemption, set in 1911, 12 years after the events of Red Dead Redemption 2, is a changed man. He's working as an enforcer for Colonel Agustin Allende, a corrupt Mexican army officer who's allied with the remnants of the Diaz regime that Javier once fought against. This is a stunning betrayal of everything Javier once believed in, everything he fought for as a young revolutionary. Javier fled Mexico because he killed a powerful man in opposition to the Diaz dictatorship, because he believed in justice and freedom for his people. Now he's working for the very type of corrupt official he once opposed, helping to oppress the Mexican people he once tried to liberate. This transformation from revolutionary to enforcer for a corrupt regime is tragic and revealing. It shows how far Javier has fallen, how completely he's abandoned his principles and his ideals. The young Javier who joined Dutch's gang believed in something, believed in justice and freedom and fighting for the oppressed. The older Javier working for Allende believes in nothing except survival and self-interest. He's become exactly the type of person he once fought against, using violence to maintain an unjust system rather than to challenge it. When John Marston, now working for the government to hunt down his former gang members, comes to Mexico looking for Javier and Bill, Javier is initially unaware of John's presence. John has to work with various factions in the Mexican Revolution, helping rebels and government forces alike in his search for his former friends. When John finally tracks down Javier, the confrontation is tense and painful. These were men who were once brothers, who fought together and trusted each other with their lives. Now they're on opposite sides, with John hunting Javier to save his own family. Javier's reaction to seeing John again is complex. There's recognition and perhaps some nostalgia for their shared past, but there's also fear and anger. Javier knows why John is there, knows that John is hunting him for the government. Javier feels betrayed by John, feels that John has sold out to the very authorities they once fought against. But there's also an element of projection in Javier's anger, because Javier has also betrayed his principles by working for Allende. Both men have compromised themselves, both have done things that would have shamed their younger selves, but Javier can't or won't acknowledge his own betrayal while condemning John's. The confrontation between John and Javier can end in two ways. Depending on player choice, John can kill Javier in a shootout, ending Javier's story with violence and death, or John can capture Javier alive, taking him back to the American authorities to face trial and imprisonment. The game doesn't specify which ending is canonical, leaving it ambiguous whether Javier dies in Mexico or is captured and imprisoned. Either way, Javier's story ends in defeat and disgrace, a far cry from the idealistic revolutionary or the loyal gang member he once was. Javier's story is ultimately about the corruption of idealism and the cost of misplaced loyalty. Javier started with genuine ideals, fighting for justice and freedom in Mexico, believing in something larger than himself. When he joined Dutch's gang, he thought he'd found a new cause to believe in, a new way to fight for justice and live according to principles. But Dutch's cause was always more about Dutch's ego than about any real principles, and Javier's loyalty to Dutch led him to abandon his real principles in favour of following a man who didn't deserve that loyalty. The tragedy of Javier's story is that his loyalty, which should have been a virtue, became the mechanism of his downfall. If Javier had been less loyal, if he'd been willing to question Dutch and recognise when Dutch was wrong, he might have sided with Arthur and John when the gang split. He might have escaped with them, might have had a chance at redemption, or at least at a better life than the one he ended up with. But Javier's loyalty to Dutch was so complete, so fundamental to his identity, that he couldn't break it even when breaking it was clearly the right thing to do. This raises interesting questions about the nature of loyalty, and when loyalty becomes a vice rather than a virtue. Loyalty is generally considered admirable, a sign of good character and strong relationships. But loyalty to a bad person or a bad cause isn't admirable, it's complicity. Javier's loyalty to Dutch made him complicit in Dutch's crimes and betrayals, made him an accomplice to Dutch's destruction of the gang and abandonment of the people who'd followed him for years. Javier's loyalty prevented him from seeing truth, from doing what was right, from protecting the people he cared about from Dutch's increasingly destructive behaviour. The game presents Javier's loyalty somewhat sympathetically, showing it as rooted in genuine gratitude and affection, rather than in stupidity or malice. Javier isn't a villain in Red Dead Redemption 2. He's a tragic figure who makes understandable but wrong choices. His loyalty to Dutch is understandable given that Dutch saved his life and gave him a new family. His inability to see Dutch's flaws is understandable, given how much Javier needs to believe in Dutch and what Dutch represents. His choice to side with Dutch over Arthur is understandable, given the depth of his bond with Dutch, and his fear of losing the only family and purpose he has. But understanding Javier's choices doesn't mean excusing them. Javier had opportunities to see the truth about Dutch, to recognize that Dutch was leading the gang toward destruction. Arthur tried to show him, tried to get him to see that Dutch had changed, and that following Dutch would only lead to death or capture. Other gang members questioned Dutch's decisions and expressed doubts about his leadership. The evidence was there for anyone willing to see it. But Javier chose not to see it, chose to maintain his loyalty to Dutch, even when that loyalty required ignoring obvious truth and betraying friends who deserved better. Javier's transformation from idealistic revolutionary to corrupt enforcer is particularly tragic because it shows the complete abandonment of everything he once believed in. The young Javier who fought against the Diaz dictatorship believed in justice, freedom, and fighting for the oppressed. He was willing to risk his life for these principles, willing to kill and to flee his home rather than submit to injustice. This Javier had integrity and courage, even if his methods were violent and his cause was ultimately unsuccessful. The older Javier working for Colonel Allende has abandoned all of these principles. He's working for a corrupt official who oppresses the Mexican people, who represents everything Javier once fought against. Javier is using his skills and his violence not to fight injustice but to maintain it, not to liberate his people, but to help keep them oppressed. This isn't just a compromise or a pragmatic choice. It's a complete betrayal of everything Javier once was and believed. The young revolutionary Javier would have been horrified and disgusted by what he became. This transformation didn't happen suddenly or all at once. It was a gradual process of compromise and rationalization, each choice making the next one easier, each betrayal of principle making the next betrayal less shocking. Javier's loyalty to Dutch was the first compromise, choosing personal loyalty over principle, choosing belonging over integrity. When Javier sided with Dutch over Arthur, he was choosing loyalty to a man over loyalty to what was right. When Javier fled with Dutch and abandoned the gang members who opposed Dutch, he was choosing self-preservation over friendship and responsibility. After the gang fell apart and Javier returned to Mexico, he probably told himself he was just surviving, just doing what was necessary to stay alive in a dangerous world. Working for Allende was just a job, just a way to make money and have protection. Javier probably rationalized it, told himself it didn't matter who he worked for as long as he survived. But these rationalizations are how principles die, how idealistic young revolutionaries become corrupt enforcers for the very systems they once opposed. Each compromise makes the next one easier, each rationalization makes the next betrayal less shocking, until you wake up one day and realize you've become everything you once hated. The contrast between Javier and Arthur is instructive and tragic. Both men were loyal to Dutch, both believed in him and followed him for years. But when Dutch's true nature became undeniable, when Dutch started betraying the principles he claimed to uphold, Arthur and Javier made different choices. Arthur chose to break with Dutch, to prioritize doing what was right over maintaining loyalty to a man who didn't deserve it. This choice cost Arthur dearly. It meant breaking with the only family he'd known, accepting that he'd wasted years of his life following a lie, facing his own mortality without the comfort of believing his life had meaning and purpose. But Arthur's choice also allowed him to achieve redemption, to become a better man in his final months, to ensure that John and his family escaped and had a chance at a better life. Arthur died knowing he'd done the right thing, knowing he'd helped people who deserved help, knowing he'd stood up to Dutch and Micah even when it cost him everything. Arthur's story is tragic but also redemptive, showing that it's never too late to do the right thing, that breaking with a bad cause is better than maintaining loyalty to it. Javier made the opposite choice. He maintained his loyalty to Dutch even when Dutch was clearly wrong, even when that loyalty required betraying friends and abandoning principles. This choice allowed Javier to avoid the pain of breaking with Dutch, to maintain his sense of belonging and purpose, to avoid confronting the reality that he'd wasted years following a man who didn't deserve his loyalty. But this choice also prevented Javier from achieving any redemption, from becoming better, from doing what was right when it mattered most. The result is that Javier's story ends in disgrace and defeat, working for a corrupt regime, hunted by his former friend, dying or being captured without dignity or redemption. Javier's loyalty to Dutch, which he probably thought was his greatest virtue, became the mechanism of his destruction. If Javier had been willing to break with Dutch when Arthur did, if he'd been willing to prioritize doing what was right over maintaining loyalty to a man who'd betrayed everything he claimed to believe, Javier might have had a different ending. But Javier couldn't or wouldn't make that choice, and the result is a tragic waste of a man who once had principles and ideals worth fighting for. Javier's relationship with the other gang members is worth examining in more detail, as these relationships show different aspects of his character and his choices. Javier's friendship with Arthur was genuine and deep, built on years of working together, fighting together, and trusting each other. Arthur clearly liked and respected Javier, saw him as a brother and a friend. When Arthur is dying and trying to save John, when Arthur is making his final stand against Dutch and Micah, he probably hoped Javier would support him, would recognize that Dutch was wrong, and that doing the right thing mattered more than maintaining loyalty. Javier's failure to support Arthur in this crucial moment is a betrayal of their friendship, even if Javier didn't see it that way. By siding with Dutch, by refusing to support Arthur against Dutch's increasingly destructive behaviour, Javier was choosing Dutch over Arthur, was valuing his loyalty to Dutch more than his friendship with Arthur. The fact that Javier couldn't bring himself to point his gun at Arthur shows that he still cared about Arthur, that he was conflicted about his choice. But in a moment of crisis, being conflicted isn't enough. Arthur needed Javier's support, and Javier failed to provide it. Javier's relationship with John was also close, though perhaps less deep than his friendship with Arthur. John was younger and less mature, more prone to mistakes and poor judgment, but Javier seemed to like him and enjoy his company. When John is captured after the train robbery and Dutch hesitates to rescue him, Javier sides with Dutch rather than supporting Arthur's insistence that they rescue John immediately. This is another betrayal, another moment when Javier's loyalty to Dutch overrides his friendship and his sense of what's right. When John comes hunting for Javier in Red Dead Redemption, 12 years after the gang fell apart, Javier's reaction is anger and betrayal. Javier feels that John has sold out, that John is working for the government and hunting his former friends. But this anger is somewhat hypocritical, because Javier has also betrayed his principles by working for Allende. Both men have compromised themselves. Both have done things that would have shamed their younger selves. But Javier can't or won't acknowledge his own betrayal while condemning John's. The truth is that John's situation is more sympathetic than Javier's. John is hunting his former gang members because the government is holding his family hostage, because it's the only way to save his wife and son. John doesn't want to hunt Javier and Bill, doesn't take pleasure in it, but he does it because he has no choice if he wants to protect his family. Javier, by contrast, is working for Allende by choice, because it's profitable and provides protection, not because he's being coerced or because he's protecting anyone he loves. John is doing something dishonourable to protect his family, while Javier is doing something dishonourable for money and security. Javier's relationship with Bill Williamson is interesting because both men make similar choices when the gang splits, both siding with Dutch over Arthur, both fleeing with Dutch and Micah, but their motivations seem different. Bill sides with Dutch partly out of loyalty, but also partly out of stupidity and inability to think for himself. Bill isn't smart enough to see through Dutch's manipulation, isn't capable of the kind of critical thinking that would allow him to recognize that Dutch is wrong. Javier, by contrast, is intelligent and perceptive enough to see the truth if he wanted to. Javier's choice to side with Dutch is more about emotional loyalty and fear of losing his sense of belonging than about inability to see the truth. After the gang falls apart, Bill and Javier go their separate ways. Bill forms his own gang in New Mexico, becoming a brutal and incompetent gang leader who terrorizes the region. Javier returns to Mexico and eventually ends up working for Allende. When John comes hunting for them, Bill and Javier are allies of convenience, both wanted by the American government, both hiding in Mexico. But there doesn't seem to be much genuine friendship or loyalty between them at this point. They're both survivors doing what they need to do to stay alive, and their shared past in the Van der Linde gang is more a source of danger than of comfort. Javier's relationship with Dutch is the most important and most tragic of all his relationships. Dutch saved Javier's life, gave him a new family and purpose, and became a father figure to him. Javier's loyalty to Dutch was rooted in genuine gratitude and affection, in real belief that Dutch was a good man trying to do right by his people. This loyalty was Javier's defining characteristic, the thing that shaped his choices and his identity. But Dutch didn't deserve this loyalty, and Javier's inability to see this or to break with Dutch, even when Dutch's true nature became undeniable, led to Javier's downfall. Dutch's manipulation of Javier was subtle and effective. Dutch didn't need to threaten or coerce Javier, he just needed to appeal to Javier's loyalty and his fear of losing the only family he had. When Arthur and others started questioning Dutch's leadership, Dutch framed it as betrayal, as people abandoning the gang and abandoning him. Dutch made it seem like supporting him was the same as supporting the gang. That loyalty to Dutch was the same as loyalty to the family they'd built together. This framing was effective because it played on Javier's deepest fears as needs. His fear of being alone again, his need to belong to something larger than himself. Javier couldn't see or couldn't accept that Dutch was the one betraying the gang, that Dutch's ego and paranoia were destroying the family they'd built. Javier needed to believe in Dutch, needed to believe that following Dutch was the right thing to do, because accepting the truth would have meant accepting that he'd wasted years of his life following a lie. This is a common psychological phenomenon, the sunk cost fallacy, where people continue investing in something that's clearly failing because they've already invested so much that admitting failure feels impossible. Javier had invested years of his life in the gang and in his loyalty to Dutch. Accepting that Dutch was wrong, that the gang was doomed, that his loyalty had been misplaced, would have meant accepting that those years were wasted, that his sacrifices were for nothing. This was too painful for Javier to accept, so he chose to maintain his loyalty to Dutch, even when that loyalty required ignoring obvious truth and betraying friends who deserved better. This choice is understandable from a psychological perspective, but it's still a choice, and Javier bears responsibility for it. The question of whether Javier could have made different choices, whether he could have broken with Dutch and sided with Arthur, is interesting to consider. On one hand, Javier's loyalty to Dutch was so deep and so fundamental to his identity that breaking it might have been psychologically impossible for him. Javier's entire sense of self was built around being Dutch's loyal follower, around belonging to the gang and believing in Dutch's vision. Breaking with Dutch would have meant destroying this identity and facing the world alone again, something Javier had done once before when he fled Mexico, and something he probably couldn't bear to do again. On the other hand, Arthur managed to break with Dutch despite having an even deeper and longer relationship with him. Arthur had been with Dutch since he was a teenager, had been raised by Dutch and Hosea, had devoted his entire adult life to the gang. If Arthur could break with Dutch when Dutch's true nature became undeniable, then Javier could have too. The difference is that Arthur was forced to confront his own mortality through his tuberculosis diagnosis, and this forced him to think about what really mattered, about what kind of man he wanted to be in his final months. Javier didn't have this kind of catalyst, didn't have anything that forced him to question his loyalty and his choices, but even without a terminal illness forcing him to confront mortality and meaning, Javier had opportunities to make better choices. He could have listened to Arthur's warnings about Dutch. He could have recognized that Dutch's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic and dangerous. He could have prioritized his friendships with Arthur and John over his loyalty to Dutch. He could have chosen to do what was right rather than what was comfortable. Javier didn't make these choices, and while his failure is understandable, it's still a failure, and Javier bears responsibility for it. Javier's story also raises questions about the nature of family and belonging. The Van der Linde gang presented itself as a family, a group of people who looked after each other, and who were bound by something deeper than just profit or convenience. This family narrative was powerful and appealing, especially for people like Javier who'd lost their biological families or who'd been rejected by mainstream society. The gang offered belonging, purpose, and genuine relationships in a world that offered these things to very few people, especially to outcasts and criminals. But the gang's family narrative was always partly a lie. or at least partly manipulation. Dutch used the language of family to create loyalty and to make gang members feel obligated to follow him and sacrifice for him. The family narrative made it harder for gang members to leave or to question Dutch's leadership, because leaving the gang felt like abandoning family, and questioning Dutch felt like betraying the person who'd created and maintained the family. This manipulation was effective because it played on real human needs and real emotions, but it was still manipulation. The gang was a family in some ways. The bonds between members were real, and the care they showed for each other was genuine. But it was also a criminal organization led by a narcissistic manipulator who ultimately cared more about his own ego than about the people who followed him. The tension between these two realities, between the gang as genuine family and the gang as criminal enterprise led by a manipulator, is central to understanding the tragedy of Red Dead Redemption 2. Gang members like Javier wanted to believe in the family narrative, needed to believe in it, and this need made them vulnerable to Dutch's manipulation. When the gang fell apart, when Dutch's true nature became undeniable, gang members had to choose between maintaining the family narrative and accepting reality. Arthur chose reality, recognizing that Dutch had betrayed the family and that the family narrative was no longer true if it ever had been. Javier chose the narrative, maintaining his loyalty to Dutch and his belief in the gang, even when doing so required ignoring obvious truth. This choice allowed Javier to maintain his sense of belonging and purpose in the short term, but it ultimately led to his downfall and disgrace. Javier's musical talent is worth discussing because it shows a side of his character that's often overlooked in discussions of his loyalty and his choices. Javier was a skilled guitarist and singer, and he often played music around the camp, entertaining the gang and creating moments of beauty and culture in the midst of their violent, chaotic lives. This musical talent shows that Javier was more than just a gunfighter or a loyal follower. He was someone with artistic sensibility and the ability to create and appreciate beauty. The songs Javier plays and sings are often Mexican folk songs or revolutionary songs, connecting him to his heritage and his past as a revolutionary. These songs are about love, loss, struggle, and resistance, themes that resonate with Javier's own life and experiences. When Javier plays music, he's not just entertaining the gang, he's expressing something about himself, about where he came from and what he believes or once believed. The music is a connection to the idealistic young revolutionary Javier once was, a reminder of the principles and passions that led him to fight against the Diaz dictatorship. The tragedy is that Javier's music survives even as his principles die. In Red Dead Redemption, when John encounters Javier in Mexico, Javier is still playing guitar, still singing songs, but the music has become hollow, disconnected from any real belief or principle. Javier is singing revolutionary songs while working for a corrupt regime, playing music about resistance while helping to oppress his own people. The music that once expressed Javier's ideals and his connection to his heritage has become just performance, just entertainment, empty of real meaning or conviction. This hollowing out of Javier's music parallels the hollowing out of his character. The young Javier who joined Dutch's gang had substance, had beliefs and principles and genuine passion for justice. The older Javier working for Allende is hollow, going through the motions of life without any real conviction or purpose beyond survival. The music continues, but it's empty, just like Javier himself has become empty, a shell of the person he once was. Javier's Mexican heritage and his experience as a refugee and immigrant in America are important aspects of his character that shape his perspective and his choices. Javier came to America as a fugitive, fleeing political persecution in Mexico, arriving in a country where he didn't speak the language well and where Mexicans faced discrimination and suspicion. This experience of being an outsider, of being vulnerable and alone in a foreign country, made Javier desperate for belonging and community. When Dutch offered him that belonging, when Dutch gave him a place in the gang and treated him as an equal, it meant everything to Javier. This context helps explain why Javier's loyalty to Dutch was so absolute, and why breaking with Dutch was so difficult for him. For Javier, the gang wasn't just a criminal organization or even just a family. It was his only home, his only source of belonging in a world that had rejected him. Leaving the gang, or breaking with Dutch, would have meant being alone again, being a refugee and an outsider again, facing a hostile world without protection or community. This fear of being alone again, of losing the only home he had, made Javier willing to overlook Dutch's flaws and to maintain his loyalty, even when that loyalty required betraying his principles and his friends. The irony is that Javier's loyalty to Dutch ultimately led to exactly what he feared: being alone, being an outcast, losing his home and his community. When the gang fell apart, when Javier fled with Dutch and then eventually went his own way, he ended up alone anyway, without the family and belonging he'd sacrificed everything to maintain. If Javier had broken with Dutch and sided with Arthur and John, he might have maintained those friendships, might have had some connection to his past and some people who cared about him. But by choosing Dutch over his friends, Javier lost everything anyway, and he ended up alone and working for people he once would have despised. Javier's return to Mexico after the gang fell apart is significant, because it represents both a physical return to his homeland and a betrayal of everything he once fought for there. Javier fled Mexico as a revolutionary, as someone who'd killed a powerful man in opposition to the Diaz dictatorship, as someone who believed in justice and freedom for his people. When he returns to Mexico years later, he's no longer a revolutionary. He's an enforcer for the very type of corrupt official he once opposed. This return is a kind of defeat, an acknowledgement that his revolutionary ideals failed and that he's given up on fighting for justice. Working for Colonel Allende is the ultimate betrayal of Javier's younger self and his revolutionary principles. Allende is exactly the type of corrupt, brutal official that Javier once fought against. Allende oppresses the Mexican people, serves the interests of the wealthy and powerful, and uses violence to maintain an unjust system. The young revolutionary Javier would have seen Allende as an enemy, as someone who deserved to be killed for his crimes against the people. The older Javier, working for Allende, has abandoned all of these principles, has decided that survival and self-interest matter more than justice or integrity. This transformation is tragic but also somewhat realistic. Many revolutionaries and idealists, when their causes fail, and when they're forced to survive in a world that doesn't reward idealism, end up compromising their principles and working for the very systems they once opposed. The process is gradual, each compromise making the next one easier, each rationalization making the next betrayal less shocking. Javier probably told himself he was just surviving, just doing what was necessary to stay alive in a dangerous world. But these rationalizations are how principles die, how idealistic young revolutionaries become corrupt enforcers for unjust systems. The Mexican Revolution, which is ongoing during the events of Red Dead Redemption in 1911, provides context for Javier's choices and his betrayal of his principles. The revolution was a genuine popular uprising against the Diaz dictatorship and the corrupt officials who served it, a movement that sought land reform, workers' rights, and political freedom. This was exactly the kind of cause that the young Javier had fought for, exactly the kind of revolution he'd risked his life to support. But the older Javier, working for Allende, is on the wrong side of this revolution, is helping to oppress the revolutionaries rather than supporting them. This positioning shows how completely Javier has betrayed his younger self and his principles. He's not just failing to support the revolution, he's actively working against it, using his skills and his violence to help maintain the unjust system the revolutionaries are fighting to overthrow. When John Marston arrives in Mexico and ends up helping various revolutionary factions, he's doing what Javier should be doing, what the young Javier would have done. The contrast between John, the former outlaw who helps the revolutionaries, and Javier, the former revolutionary who works for the corrupt regime, is stark and damning. Javier's fate, whether he's killed by John or captured and taken back to America to face trial, is tragic and somewhat pathetic. This is a man who once had principles and ideals worth fighting for, who once believed in something larger than himself, who once had the courage to risk his life for justice. But through a series of choices and compromises, through misplaced loyalty and fear of being alone, Javier became a hollow shell of his former self, working for people he once would have despised, betraying everything he once believed in. His end, dying or being captured in Mexico while working for a corrupt regime, is a far cry from the heroic revolutionary death he might have imagined for himself as a young man. The question of whether Javier deserves sympathy or condemnation is complicated and doesn't have a clear answer. On one hand, Javier's choices were his own, and he bears responsibility for them. He chose to maintain his loyalty to Dutch even when Dutch was clearly wrong. He chose to betray his friends and his principles. He chose to work for Allende and to help oppress his own people. These choices weren't forced on him. He made them freely, and he deserves to be held accountable for them. On the other hand, Javier's choices were shaped by circumstances and experiences that made them understandable, if not excusable. His experience as a refugee and immigrant made him desperate for belonging. His gratitude to Dutch for saving his life created a sense of obligation that was hard to break. His fear of being alone again made him willing to overlook Dutch's flaws and maintain his loyalty, even when it was clearly wrong. These factors don't excuse Javier's choices, but they help explain them. Help us understand why a man who once had principles and ideals ended up betraying everything he believed in. The game's treatment of Javier is somewhat sympathetic, presenting him as a tragic figure rather than a villain. In Red Dead Redemption 2, Javier is shown as a loyal, capable, and generally likeable gang member who makes understandable but wrong choices when the gang falls apart. His moment of pointing his gun in the air rather than at Arthur shows that he's conflicted, that he still cares about his friends even as he chooses Dutch over them. This presentation invites players to see Javier as a tragic figure whose loyalty and fear led him to make terrible choices, rather than as a villain who deserves only condemnation. In Red Dead Redemption, Javier is presented more negatively, as a corrupt enforcer working for a brutal regime, as someone who's betrayed his principles and his people. But even here, there's some sympathy in his presentation, Javier's anger at John feels genuine. His sense of betrayal seems real, even if it's somewhat hypocritical. When John confronts Javier, there's a sense of tragedy, of two former friends who've both compromised themselves in different ways, who've both ended up in places their younger selves would have been ashamed of. Javier's story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of misplaced loyalty and the importance of maintaining principles even when doing so is difficult or costly. Javier's loyalty to Dutch was admirable in some ways, rooted in genuine gratitude and affection. But loyalty to a bad person or a bad cause isn't a virtue, it's a vice. Javier's loyalty prevented him from seeing truth, from doing what was right, from protecting the people he cared about from Dutch's destructive behaviour. If Javier had been willing to question his loyalty, to prioritise his principles and his friendships over his need to belong and his fear of being alone, he might have had a different ending. The contrast between Javier and Arthur is instructive. Both men were loyal to Dutch, both believed in him, and followed him for years. But when Dutch's true nature became undeniable, Arthur chose to break with him, to prioritise doing what was right over maintaining loyalty to a man who didn't deserve it. This choice was painful and costly for Arthur, but it also allowed him to achieve redemption, to become a better man in his final months, to ensure that people he cared about had chances at better lives. Arthur's story shows that it's never too late to do the right thing, that breaking with a bad cause is better than maintaining loyalty to it. Javier made the opposite choice, maintaining his loyalty to Dutch even when Dutch was clearly wrong, even when that loyalty required betraying friends and abandoning principles. This choice allowed Javier to avoid the pain of breaking with Dutch in the short term, but it led to his downfall and disgrace in the long term. Javier's story shows the cost of misplaced loyalty, the danger of valuing belonging over principle, the tragedy of compromising yourself to maintain relationships that aren't worth maintaining. The theme of identity is central to Javier's story. Javier's identity was built around being a revolutionary, then around being a loyal member of the Van der Linde gang, then around being Dutch's follower. Each of these identities gave Javier purpose and belonging, gave him a sense of who he was and what he was fighting for. But each of these identities was also fragile, dependent on external circumstances and relationships rather than on internal principles or values. When the gang fell apart and Dutch's true nature became undeniable, Javier's identity collapsed because it was built on loyalty to Dutch, rather than on any independent sense of self or principle. This fragility of identity is a common human experience, especially for people who've experienced trauma or displacement. Javier's experience as a refugee, fleeing his home and arriving alone in a foreign country, would have been deeply traumatic and would have shaken his sense of identity and belonging. When Dutch offered him a new identity as a member of the gang, Javier embraced it completely, perhaps too completely, building his entire sense of self around this new role and this new family. This made Javier's identity dependent on the gang and on Dutch, which meant that when the gang fell apart, Javier's identity fell apart with it. If Javier had maintained a stronger sense of independent identity, if he'd held on to his revolutionary principles and his sense of self separate from his role in the gang, he might have been able to break with Dutch when Dutch betrayed those principles. But Javier's identity was so completely bound up with being Dutch's loyal follower that breaking with Dutch would have meant destroying his sense of self. This made breaking with Dutch psychologically very difficult, perhaps impossible, even when maintaining loyalty to Dutch required betraying everything Javier once believed in. The question of what Javier could have become if he'd made different choices is poignant and tragic. If Javier had sided with Arthur when the gang split, if he'd broken with Dutch and helped Arthur save John and his family, Javier might have achieved some measure of redemption. He might have maintained his friendships with Arthur and John, might have had some connection to his past and some people who cared about him. He might have returned to Mexico and joined the revolution, fighting for the principles he once believed in rather than working for the corrupt regime he once opposed. But Javier didn't make these choices, and we can only speculate about what might have been. The Javier we see in Red Dead Redemption is a broken man, hollow and corrupt, working for people he once would have despised, betraying everything he once believed in. His end, whether death or capture, is tragic and somewhat pathetic, a far cry from the heroic revolutionary or the loyal gang member he once was. Javier's story is a tragedy of wasted potential, of a man who had principles and ideals and courage, but who lost all of these things through fear and misplaced loyalty. Javier's relationship with his Mexican heritage is complex and evolves throughout his story. As a young revolutionary in Mexico, Javier's Mexican identity was central to who he was and what he fought for. He was fighting for his people, for Mexican peasants and workers who were oppressed by the Diaz dictatorship. His revolutionary activities were an expression of his Mexican identity and his commitment to his people's liberation. When Javier fled Mexico, he lost this connection to his heritage and his people, becoming a refugee and an outsider in a foreign country. Joining the Van der Linde gang gave Javier a new identity and a new sense of belonging, but it also meant further disconnection from his Mexican heritage. The gang was primarily American, operating in American territories, and while Javier maintained his language and his music, he was living in a world that wasn't his own. This disconnection from his heritage might have contributed to Javier's desperate loyalty to the gang, as the gang became his only source of identity and belonging after he'd lost his connection to Mexico and his revolutionary cause. When Javier returns to Mexico after the gang falls apart, it's both a return to his heritage and a betrayal of it. He's back in his homeland, speaking his language, surrounded by his people, but he's working for the very type of corrupt official he once fought against, helping to oppress the people he once tried to liberate. This return to Mexico is hollow, a physical return without any real reconnection to his heritage or his principles. Javier is in Mexico, but he's not of Mexico anymore. He's become something else, something that doesn't belong anywhere. The theme of belonging is central to understanding Javier's choices and his tragedy. Javier's desperate need for belonging, for family and community, drove many of his decisions and ultimately led to his downfall. This need for belonging is understandable and human. We all need connection and community. We all need to feel like we're part of something larger than ourselves. But Javier's need for belonging was so strong, so desperate, that it overrode his principles and his judgment, making him willing to follow Dutch, even when Dutch was clearly wrong, making him willing to betray his friends and his ideals to maintain his place in the gang. This desperation for belonging came from Javier's experiences of loss and displacement. He'd lost his home in Mexico, had been alone and vulnerable in America, had experienced what it was like to be an outsider, without protection, or community. When Dutch offered him belonging, when the gang became his family, Javier held on to it with desperate intensity, terrified of losing it and being alone again. This fear made Javier vulnerable to manipulation, made him willing to overlook Dutch's flaws and to maintain his loyalty, even when that loyalty required terrible compromises. The tragedy is that Javier's desperate attempt to maintain his belonging ultimately led to him losing it anyway. By choosing Dutch over Arthur and John, by refusing to break with Dutch even when Dutch was clearly wrong, Javier lost the friendships and connections that might have survived the gang's collapse. If Javier had been willing to prioritize his friendships and his principles over his loyalty to Dutch, he might have maintained some connections to his past, some relationships with people who cared about him. But by choosing Dutch, Javier lost everything, ending up alone anyway, working for people who didn't care about him, without friends or family or any real sense of belonging. Javier's story raises questions about the nature of loyalty and when loyalty becomes destructive rather than constructive. Loyalty is generally considered a virtue, a sign of good character and strong relationships. But loyalty can also be destructive when it's given to people or causes that don't deserve it, when it prevents us from seeing truth or doing what's right, when it makes us complicit in harm and injustice. Javier's loyalty to Dutch was destructive in all of these ways, preventing him from seeing Dutch's true nature, preventing him from doing what was right when the gang split, making him complicit in Dutch's betrayal of the gang and abandonment of the people who'd followed him. The question of how to balance loyalty with principle, how to maintain commitments while also being willing to break them when they become destructive, is difficult and doesn't have easy answers. Javier's story suggests that principles should take precedence over loyalty, that we should be willing to break with people or causes when they betray the values they claim to uphold. Arthur's story supports this lesson, showing that breaking with Dutch when Dutch betrayed his principles was the right thing to do, even though it was painful and costly. But the game also shows sympathy for Javier's difficulty in breaking with Dutch, acknowledging that loyalty and belonging are powerful human needs that can't be easily dismissed or overcome. Javier's failure to break with Dutch is presented as tragic rather than simply villainous, as an understandable human failing rather than as pure evil. This nuanced presentation invites players to think about the complexity of loyalty and belonging, about how difficult it can be to break with people or causes we've invested ourselves in, even when breaking with them is clearly the right thing to do. Javier Escuella's story is ultimately about the cost of misplaced loyalty, the danger of building your identity around belonging to a group or following a leader, and the tragedy of betraying your principles to maintain relationships that aren't worth maintaining. Javier started as an idealistic revolutionary fighting for justice in Mexico, became a loyal gang member who believed in Dutch's vision, and ended as a corrupt enforcer working for the very type of regime he once opposed. This transformation wasn't sudden or inevitable. It was the result of choices Javier made, compromises he accepted, principles he abandoned in favor of maintaining his loyalty to Dutch and his place in the gang. The tragedy of Javier's story is that his loyalty, which should have been a virtue, became the mechanism of his destruction. If Javier had been less loyal, if he'd been willing to question Dutch and prioritize his principles over his need for belonging, he might have had a different ending. But Javier's loyalty to Dutch was so complete, so fundamental to his identity, that he couldn't break it even when breaking it was clearly the right thing to do. The result is a wasted life. A man who once had ideals and courage ending up hollow and corrupt, dying or being captured without dignity or redemption, remembered not as the revolutionary he once was, but as the betrayer he became. Javier's story serves as a warning about the dangers of blind loyalty, about the importance of maintaining independent judgment and principles even when doing so threatens our sense of belonging. It shows that loyalty without principle is not a virtue but a vice, that following someone simply because we're loyal to them rather than because they deserve our loyalty leads to complicity in their crimes and betrayal of our own values. And it shows that the desperate need for belonging, while understandable and human, can make us vulnerable to manipulation and can lead us to betray everything we once believed in. In the end, Javier Escuella is a tragic figure, a man who had potential for greatness but who made choices that led to his downfall. His story is a reminder that our choices matter, that loyalty must be balanced with principle, and that maintaining our integrity and our values is more important than maintaining our place in any group or our loyalty to any leader. Javier's failure to learn these lessons led to his destruction, and his story stands as a cautionary tale about the cost of misplaced loyalty and the importance of having the courage to break with people or causes when they betray the principles they claim to uphold. The legacy of Javier Escuella within the Red Dead Redemption universe is one of tragedy and wasted potential. Among the former members of the Van der Linde gang, Javier occupies a unique position. He's not as sympathetic as Arthur, who achieved redemption through sacrifice. He's not as villainous as Micah, who was always cruel and self-serving. He's not as pathetic as Bill, whose stupidity and brutality made him easy to condemn. Javier falls somewhere in between, a man who once had principles and ideals but who abandoned them through fear and misplaced loyalty. When players encounter Javier in Red Dead Redemption, 12 years after the gang's collapse, the contrast between who he was and who he's become is stark and painful. The Javier of 1899 was charming, talented, loyal and capable. He had friends who cared about him, skills that were valuable, and at least some connection to his principles and his heritage. The Javier of 1911 is hollow and corrupt, working for people he once would have despised, without real friends or connections, having betrayed everything he once believed in. The transformation is complete and tragic. The confrontation between John and Javier in Red Dead Redemption is one of the game's most emotionally complex moments. These were men who were once brothers, who fought together and trusted each other with their lives. They shared years of experiences, dangers and triumphs. They were part of the same family, bound by loyalty and shared purpose. Now they're on opposite sides, with John hunting Javier to save his own family, and Javier seeing John as a betrayer who sold out to the government. The tragedy is that both men have betrayed their younger selves and their principles in different ways. John is hunting his former friends for the government, doing exactly the kind of work that the Van der Linde gang once opposed. Javier is working for a corrupt Mexican official, helping to oppress the people he once tried to liberate. Both men have compromised themselves, both have done things that would have shamed their younger selves. But John's compromise is more sympathetic because he's doing it to protect his family, because he has no choice if he wants to save his wife and son. Javier's compromise is less sympathetic because he's doing it for money and security, because he's chosen survival and self-interest over principle. When John finally confronts Javier, the dialogue between them is bitter and accusatory. Javier accuses John of betraying the gang, of selling out to the government, of hunting his former friends. John responds that Javier betrayed himself, that he's working for the very type of corrupt official he once opposed, that he's become everything he once hated. Both accusations are true. Both men have betrayed something important. But Javier's betrayal is more complete and more damning because he's betrayed not just his friends but his principles, not just his past but his entire identity as someone who once fought for justice. The player's choice in how to resolve the confrontation with Javier, whether to kill him or capture him alive, reflects different interpretations of Javier's character and his culpability. Killing Javier can be seen as justice, as giving him the death he probably deserves for his crimes and his betrayals. It's also arguably more merciful than capture, as death is quick while capture means imprisonment and disgrace. Capturing Javier alive can be seen as giving him a chance to face justice through the legal system, or as a crueler punishment that forces him to live with his failures and his shame. The game doesn't specify which choice is canonical, leaving it ambiguous whether Javier dies in Mexico or is captured and imprisoned. This ambiguity is probably intentional, allowing players to decide for themselves what Javier deserves and what kind of ending is most appropriate for his story. Either way, Javier's story ends in defeat and disgrace. Far from the heroic revolutionary or loyal gang member he once was. His end is tragic but also somewhat fitting, the natural consequence of the choices he made and the principles he abandoned. Javier's story also serves as commentary on the nature of revolution and idealism. Javier started as a revolutionary fighting against the Diaz dictatorship in Mexico, believing in justice and freedom for his people. This revolutionary idealism was genuine and admirable, rooted in real experiences of oppression and real desire to make things better. But Javier's revolutionary activities failed, forcing him to flee Mexico and abandon his cause. This failure seems to have broken something in Javier, to have taught him that idealism doesn't work, that principles are luxuries that people in his position can't afford. When Javier joined the Van der Linde gang, he thought he'd found a new cause to believe in, a new way to fight for justice and live according to principles. But Dutch's cause was always more about Dutch's ego than about any real principles, and when the gang fell apart, Javier was left without any cause or principles to guide him. His return to Mexico and his work for Allende represent the complete abandonment of his revolutionary ideals, the acceptance that survival and self-interest are all that matter, that principles and justice are illusions that only fools believe in. This trajectory from idealistic revolutionary to corrupt enforcer is tragic, but also somewhat realistic. Many revolutionaries, when their causes fail, and when they're forced to survive in a hostile world, end up compromising their principles and working for the very systems they once opposed. The process is gradual and insidious, each compromise making the next one easier, each rationalization making the next betrayal less shocking. Javier's story shows how this process works, how someone who once had genuine ideals and courage can end up hollow and corrupt, betraying everything they once believed in. But Javier's story also shows that this trajectory isn't inevitable, that people can maintain their principles even when doing so is difficult or costly. Arthur maintained his principles in his final months, breaking with Dutch and doing what was right, even though it cost him everything. John, despite his compromises, maintains some connection to his principles and his humanity, doing what he must to protect his family, but not losing himself completely in the process. The contrast between these characters and Javier shows that maintaining principles is possible, even in difficult circumstances, that the choices we make matter and that we bear responsibility for them. Javier's musical talent and his connection to Mexican culture add depth to his character and make his betrayal of his principles more tragic. The songs Javier plays and sings are often about resistance, struggle, love, and loss, themes that connect to his revolutionary past and his experiences as a refugee and immigrant. When Javier plays music in the gang's camps, he's not just entertaining people, he's expressing something about himself, about his heritage and his beliefs. The music is a connection to who he once was, to the idealistic young revolutionary who believed in justice and fought for his people. The fact that Javier continues to play music even after he's betrayed his principles makes his corruption more tragic. The music continues, but it's become hollow, disconnected from any real belief or conviction. Javier is singing songs about resistance while helping to oppress his people, playing music about justice while working for a corrupt regime. The music that once expressed his ideals has become just performance, just entertainment, empty of real meaning. This hollowing out of Javier's music parallels the hollowing out of his character, showing how someone can go through the motions of who they once were, while having lost all substance and conviction. Javier's relationship with his revolutionary past is complex and painful. As a young man in Mexico, Javier's revolutionary activities gave him purpose and identity, made him part of something larger than himself. Fighting against the Diaz dictatorship was dangerous and difficult, but it was also meaningful, rooted in genuine belief that he was fighting for justice and for his people's liberation. When Javier had to flee Mexico, he lost this purpose and this identity, becoming a refugee without a cause or a home. The Van der Linde gang gave Javier a new purpose and a new identity, but it was never quite the same as his revolutionary past. The gang's activities were criminal rather than political, motivated by profit and survival rather than by ideological commitment to justice. Dutch's philosophy about living free and taking from the rich had some superficial similarity to revolutionary ideals, but it lacked the depth and the genuine commitment to social change that characterized real revolutionary movements. Javier probably recognized this difference on some level, but he needed to belong to something, needed to have purpose and community. So he embraced the gang and Dutch's philosophy as a substitute for the revolutionary cause he'd lost. When Javier returns to Mexico and ends up working for Allende, he's in a position to reconnect with his revolutionary past. The Mexican Revolution is ongoing. Genuine revolutionaries are fighting against the corrupt regime that Allende represents. Javier could join them, could return to the cause he once believed in, could fight for his people's liberation like he did as a young man. But Javier doesn't make this choice. Instead, he works for Allende, helping to oppress the revolutionaries, betraying everything his younger self believed in and fought for. This choice shows how completely Javier has abandoned his principles and his ideals. It's not just that he's failed to live up to his revolutionary past, it's that he's actively working against it. Javier would have needed to break with Allende and join the revolutionaries, to return to the cause he once believed in and fight for his people's liberation. He would have needed to acknowledge his betrayal of his principles and work to make amends for it. He would have needed to prioritize doing what was right over his own survival and security. These choices would have been difficult and dangerous, but they were possible, and making them would have allowed Javier to reconnect with his principles and achieve some measure of redemption. The But Javier didn't make these choices. He continued working for Allende, continued betraying his principles, continued prioritizing his own survival over justice or integrity. When John came hunting for him, Javier's response was anger and self-justification rather than acknowledgement of his failures or any attempt to make amends. Javier's story ends without redemption, without any return to the principles and ideals that once defined him. He dies or is captured as a corrupt enforcer for a brutal regime, having never reconnected with the revolutionary ideals that once gave his life meaning and purpose. Javier Escuella's complete story, from idealistic revolutionary to loyal gang member to corrupt enforcer, is a tragedy of compromised principles and misplaced loyalty. It shows how someone who starts with genuine ideals and courage can end up betraying everything they once believed in through a series of choices and compromises, each one making the next easier, each one moving further from the person they once were. It shows the danger of building your identity around loyalty to a person or a group rather than around independent principles and values, and it shows that the desperate need for belonging, while understandable and human, can make us vulnerable to manipulation and can lead us to betray our own values and our own best selves. In the end, Javier's story is a warning and a tragedy, a warning about the cost of misplaced loyalty and the importance of maintaining principles even when doing so threatens our sense of belonging. A tragedy about a man who had potential for greatness, but who made choices that led to his downfall and disgrace. Javier Escuella could have been a hero, a revolutionary who fought for justice, a loyal friend who stood by his principles. Instead, he became a cautionary tale about what happens when loyalty overrides principle, when the need for belonging overrides integrity, when fear of being alone makes us willing to betray everything we once believed in.